Hello everyone, hope you are doing well. Today I am going to provide you the second part of The Beauty of Breaking. Hope you like it. Don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started.
Chapter 4. Eric. Violent Behavior Alert. 4 a.m. is often a magic hour. In emergency departments all over, chances are there will be a lull in and respite from the action at around this time. The main overhead lights of the ER will still be turned down to accommodate patient rest for a couple more hours before the change in shift. It's a time when the doctor on duty can catch up on paperwork or other tasks, and maybe even steal a moment, as she sits at her desk, to watch the barest beginning of sunrise glistening through the window pane. She squints as her eyes adjust to daylight and longs for the moment when she can walk out of the hospital, inspirited by the light of a brand new day. And for a couple of hours, she is reminded that she, too, is a diurnal human being. In several hours, at 7 a.m., before I'm free to get in my car and drive home, I will take my place around a large walnut table with 6 nurses and 2 other physicians for the code meeting, where we will review issues regarding any medical research performed in the hospital. Together we will pore over the long code sheet, finding where the word atropine was written during a patient resuscitation on the telemetry unit last week. The exact location of this wording is critical to saving lives, said no one ever, who actually saves lives. Nevertheless, after 20 minutes of our discussing the word's location, I will endure a similarly inconsequential discussion about whether to move the space on the code sheet for fingerstick glucose during a 4 a.m. lull on the night shift. I prepare my thoughts on these matters, thoughts that boil down to one question: why are we meeting about this? Tomorrow I will get the notification, the phone call or email that I hope will announce the promotion that will deliver me from being merely an attendee at such meetings to being the chair, just under 2 years into the relatively minor administrative positions of Director of Departmental Performance Improvement and then Assistant Medical Director. I was bored. The hospital had just created a new position for an administrator to oversee quality on a larger scale throughout its operations. It was a job I wanted and knew I would be good at. My ed chair couldn't promote me any further within the department. The existing directors weren't going to be leaving or dying anytime soon, and therefore supported me in pursuing the position. Had assessed there might be more meaning for me, more potential for me to make an impact when I was in charge of something. I knew that when I prescribed rest, ice, compression, and elevation to a patient with an ankle sprain, or explained to a patient with tooth pain that there wasn't an abscess or dental emergency, but that it was critical for her to follow up with a dentist for a detailed exam when I did these things, I knew that these patients could hear me and that there was the potential for something important to be accomplished. I also knew that in no part of my medical training had I dreamed of spending hours contemplating how best to make sure blood cultures were drawn within 4 hours of a patient's being admitted to a regular hospital floor with community pneumonia. Frankly, it felt unfair having to spend so much of my life as a physician ruminating over minutiae that didn't actually improve people's lives. There had to be ways for me to climb this administrative ladder meaningfully. I'd find out tomorrow. Since graduating from my residency a couple of years before, I'd grown increasingly jaded and restless, and was not sure that working at an administrative level in a hospital was even what I wanted to do anymore. Yoga was helping me to cope and clarify. Gym workouts were helping, too. As was expanding my social circle, I had succumbed to peer pressure to join the online dating scene. In an effort to get back out there, this, specifically, did not help, but my entry into that world had been hesitant at best. It had nothing to do with fear. For the first time in my life, I was beginning to feel that I had found a certain comfort in my own skin. The beautiful and unexpected gift of my 30s was that I liked myself no matter the bumps or blemishes, or the raucous laughter that erupted into snorts under the right circumstances, or the smelly farts from the yummy lentil soup I made so delicious. But I learned to enjoy it sparingly. My aversion to online dating had nothing to do with the vulnerability of putting oneself on exhibition to thousands of strangers. To the contrary, I'd always found it fascinating to share a conversation with someone entirely unknown. I firmly believe that any interaction can be meaningful, even if only a brief exchange. No, I wasn't afraid of unnoting. I just wasn't sold on its effectiveness. Yes, I was well aware of the compelling arguments of 2 friends who had met their current husbands online. The same two friends later told me, independent of each other, that they would get divorced if only they had the energy to be single again, but they preferred to settle for an unhappy marriage as a means to ensure they could have a child before the advanced maternal age of 35. Given that I didn't need practice in dating, the notion of wading through hundreds of online profiles seemed to be merely a way to settle for Mr. L dash, single quotes, LL dash, give dash, up dash, give dash, in dash, and dash, make dash, it dash, work dash somehow, in a more time-efficient manner. I knew also that, for me, a relationship could be only with a man with whom I recognized a soul connection. None of me feels that this type of link can be jury-rigged by any virtual algorithm, no matter how inventive Silicon Valley considers its calculations. Still, eventually, I had relented, but I made sure to deploy the excuse of my tricky emergency medicine scheduled to keep my involvement in the process what amounted to a couple of months only tangential. There was Rick, who had clearly posted a photo from 20 years prior, and had a penchant for discussing beer and golf exclusively. I disliked both, only a little less than I disliked him. There was Doug, who repeatedly reminded me that he was an attorney, no matter the topic of conversation. Yet, when I finally bit and asked where he practiced law, he gave a verbose answer about the many ways one can be an attorney and not actually practice law. Weaving in a discussion of his entrepreneurial interests, I felt my eyes glaze over as I listened to the man lie about his identity. And I can't leave out Frank, who had obviously posted someone else's photo entirely. He rambled on about his divorce from 7 years before, how he had no hobbies, few friends, and spent all his free time co-parenting a teenager who appeared not to want to spend any time with him. It was for all these reasons that he figured he'd meet a companion through online dating. I politely finished my drink, stating, "Ugh, so sorry. I'd better rush home. I have to get to the ER tomorrow. I know it's only 6:15 p.m. now, but my morning shift starts super early. No, please, you stay and enjoy. I'm safe to walk home, and I walk pretty fast, so I don't want to be rude." I pushed my chair back to wriggle myself free from the booth. "Have a beautiful night," I added, already halfway to the door. Frank was the last. It was my experience with Frank that made it clear he should be the last. There were no regrets, and thankfully, all of them got away. I planned to use the 4 a.m. lull to avoid responding to the latest 2 date requests and instead get the code meeting preparation out of the way. Of course, in an ER downtime is never guaranteed at any hour. Just 2 weeks earlier, I had worked nonstop straight through the night. I hurried to send home the drunk who had come in 10 hours earlier and finally gotten a purchase on sobriety. The CT report on my patient in room 9 had confirmed appendicitis, so surgery was called to claim its final patient of the shift, and I had to sew up a facial laceration on an elderly man before admitting a middle-aged woman with multiple rib fractures who had taken a spill down a flight of stairs during a seizure. The stable but hypotensive patient would certainly have to be seen by the next doctor, who was already 14 minutes late for her shift, but who's counting? But on this night, a chilly Wednesday in November, the magic hour was holding. At 3:30 a.m., my last patient in the department, a 50-year-old man complaining of itchy feet for 3 months, was well on his way to being cured. There was no rash or infection, just a man who needed lotion. The pharmacist on duty was willing to oblige by sending over a tube of generic moisturizer for the patient to take home to commence the healing. And I could finally sit down at the computer to scroll through my queue on the electronic medical record tracking board to ensure that all my medical notes and orders had been signed. But first I would grab some coffee. I was so tired that my bones ached. 4 a.m. tired is nothing like being sore from yoga class or a hard run. It's a deeper throb, a psychic ache. Here is the blessing and the curse of the 4 a.m. downtime. When everything goes quiet, the texts running back and forth, the patients requesting Percocet ice and turkey sandwiches, the nurses asking you to enter all your verbal orders from last night into the computer, a physician on call for a specialty service asking if the consult you placed from the ER is really an emergency or could wait until tomorrow or, better yet, until whatever month a clinic appointment could be made for the patient in question. The inner voice swells until it becomes an existential nudge. Why am I here? What am I really doing? What's my purpose? But who has the energy to navigate this conversation at 4 a.m.? Yup, it was a good time to get coffee. Just as I had pushed my chair away from the desk, my screen flashed blue, the color code that told me a new patient had arrived. The magic hour evaporated, and what came up in the complaint tab completely dispelled any charms for AM usually held: hemorrhoid. The nurses had triaged the patient, Mr. Eric Samuels, with an emergency severity index of 4, given that the scale of patient urgency goes in descending order of severity from 1 through 5. Only a 5 was less critical. So, I wouldn't need to rush. I scrolled through the chart to make sure I didn't miss anything. 5 years later, my memories of rounds with Dr. Jaiswal were still with me. The patient didn't have a fever, and his other vitals were insignificant. Blood pressure 145/86, heart rate 76, respiratory rate 16, saturating 100% on room air. I skimmed his electronic medical record. He had a history of hemorrhoids, which each time appeared to have been treated appropriately with a brief course of steroid cream. He also had a history of an inguinal groin hernia. 5 years before, he had been seen in the hospital's outpatient surgery clinic but had declined any surgical intervention, and then had never returned to that clinic again. It didn't appear to be anything serious, but then, I saw it. A yellow flag appeared on one of the patient's earlier notes, from 3 years before: violent behavior alert. We deal with all kinds of threatening behavior in the ER. By federal law, we are required to evaluate anyone, at any time, with any ailment. For many people, the ER is the only place they can go, particularly those without medical insurance. But it's not the uninsured who use the emergency department the most, it's the insured. A 2011 survey by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention explored the reasons the insured find themselves in the ER. Often it is because they feel their health needs aren't being met by their primary care provider. Perhaps their doctor doesn't respond quickly enough to their phone call, email, or text. Even when a patient is able to reach their physician to schedule an appointment, they may feel they are simply too sick to wait for the appointment. So, when patients arrive at the ER, they may be delirious from infection or psychotic from a chemical imbalance. They may simply be belligerent drunks, or so entitled from unchecked privilege that even polite questioning causes them to blow up fuse. Whatever the case, it pays to be extremely cautious in the ER. Actual statistics on violent incidents in emergency departments are sparse. Only a small number of dedicated studies have been done. The more pressing issue is that these incidents go largely underreported. The reasons for this are manifold. Many healthcare providers feel that nothing is done when reports are made, which effectively diminishes the impetus to disclose assaults. Others, fearing they could face scrutiny or blame for not having prevented the violence, become habituated to it. It simply becomes part of the job. According to the 2003 to 2007 Workplace Safety Survey by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, workers in healthcare and social services are 5 times more likely to be victims of a non-fatal assault than average workers in all other industries combined. A 2009 Emergency Nurses Association study showed that 20% of respondents had been physically assaulted at work more than 20 times in the past 3 years. Many television programs don't depict hospital departments accurately. No, the ER staffs are not Hollywood beautiful. You won't find us in the pages of Vogue or GQ. And we're not all sleeping with one another. I've worked in only one hospital like that, and given the size of your average American, it turns out it would be extremely difficult to create an emergency airway using a steak knife, a straw, and a bit of twine. But TV does get one part of a life right. Medical personnel in hospitals are often attacked by the patients they're trying to help. In the most horrifying instances, people walk into hospitals and clinics with guns to murder providers who save lives. Anything can and does happen. Once I saw the yellow flag on Mr. Samuels's file, I took a deep breath and clicked on the alert note. Patient grabbed the left breast of female physician while she was performing an incision and drainage on his neck abscess. When it happened, the female physician put down her instrument and left the patient room. The procedure was completed by a male physician. The rest of the chart read like any other for an abscess treatment, recommending that the patient return in 2 days for a wound check. Hot bile constricted the back of my throat, and my face flushed. I didn't know what bothered me most: the patient having committed sexual assault, the offhand manner in which the attack was described, or the fact that the patient was instructed to return to the ER for routine care after he had perpetrated a crime against one of our providers. Yes, this patient would wait. He would wait while I pushed my chair back, stood up, walked to the break room, poured myself a cup of coffee, went to the restroom, and finished some notes. He would wait until I was done with everything. In the comment section next to the patient's name, I typed in history of assault on staff, and then called the triage nurse to request that he assign Mr. Samuels to one of the male nurses. Sure thing, he just has some swelling on his BAFTA, the nurse responded. I stood up, secretly hoping that the coffee pot would be empty and I'd have to beg someone to teach me how to brew a new pot. Then, I'd wait, drip by drip, until it was ready. As I turned the corner to head to the staff kitchen, I heard someone shuffling back to room 7, where Mr. Samuels had been assigned. I heard the dragging of feet and a groan of pain. With my stainless steel mug in hand, I continued past the sounds to the kitchen. There are plenty of occupations in which employees have no choice but to deal with anyone who shows up: restaurant server, flight attendant, shoe salesperson, hairstylist. Emergency medicine is the same. But before I became a doctor, I had always assumed there would be less violence and more civility in medicine. We train for a minimum of 7 years and spend countless sleepless nights restarting hearts and resetting bones. And yet, now that I was practicing, I knew that we in the ER were no different from those working in service industries. We aren't spared from rude or belligerent patients. We are punched, kicked, called cunt, and even shot at, none of which should ever happen to anyone in any line of work. But it does. And as doctors, we are exposed to this violence by the very people the law mandates us to treat. As a resident, I had trained and lived in the South Bronx. Mercy Hospital, one of the busiest hospitals in the country, had good reason to have an in-house police precinct, complete with a jail cell, given the prevalence of violent crime in that part of New York City, and the fact that Mercy was one of the highest volume trauma centers in the country. People assumed we were under constant threat. But that was not my experience. It's true that we were in the trenches, as community members, standing side by side with the South Bronx residents. We knew the police officers, firefighters, and EMTs by their first names. They'd often send the ER staff donuts after we'd helped them unload the 4th gunshot wound, 2nd cardiac arrest, or 1st pediatric stabbing of the day. We at Mercy might not have had the newest equipment and our scrubs might not have been handsomely monogrammed, but we showed up every day, many of us fueled by the strong and delicious Cuban coffee from the bodega across the street, to take care of as many patients as humanly possible. The faster we worked, the more patients arrived. The more patients, the sicker they seemed to be. If we began a 7 a.m. shift by attending to the 25 patients still in the waiting room from 10 p.m. the night before, that simply meant it was a regular Tuesday. I once treated a patient for a minor GSW to his leg. He was a drug dealer in the neighborhood, engaging from the substantial roll of money in his pocket, successful in his chosen field. At the end of my shift, he beckoned me over. "Don't worry about anything around here, Doc, I got you," he told me, and he meant it. In that way, we were a team. So, I was never physically harmed in the South Bronx. It wasn't until afterward, when I was working one day at Andrew Johnson's smaller community hospital location in South Philadelphia, that I encountered my first violent patient, a young man whose mother had brought him in heavily intoxicated. Although, at 29, he was technically an adult, in this neighborhood it was a cultural norm for grown men to come to the ER, accompanied by their mothers. That evening had been peaceful until he was rolled into the department vomiting. The 2 night nurses who were planning Girl Scout events for their daughters and the evening clerk who was surfing the web stopped what they were doing to register and triage the new arrival. The patient was deposited in the room kitty to the doctor's station. After safely dumping her son off for the ER staff to deal with, the young man's mother left, and the triage nurse kept his room dark to encourage him to sleep off his intoxication. His was a simple case. I would examine him, prescribe medicine for nausea, as well as intravenous hydration, and discharge him back to his parents in the morning. He likely needed none of these treatments. Routine intoxication is typically best treated by simply kneeling in front of a toilet bowl, but because the young man had been brought to the hospital, we were obligated to provide the medical show the family expected. "Sir, may I examine you?" I asked Sueri. He slurred as he moaned and clutched his stomach. He seemed well enough and cooperative. I told him I would examine him quickly, and then the nurse would give him medication for his vomiting. He leaned forward. His lungs were clear. He slumped back. The heart sounds were normal. "Okay, now open your eyes." I was inspecting his pupils with the otoscope. The ophthalmoscope head was missing, but really, any light source would have done the trick when, out of nowhere, a fist came careening toward my face. There was no context to his violence in that moment. There was no good reason and no appropriate justification for it. Being drunk never changes a person, but it does grant their shadow selves free rein to step forward. I heard my glasses fall to the floor and then slide across the linoleum. In the half-lit room, I saw nothing but a smear of the patient's blonde hair and pink skin. As my head jerked, I sensed movement, but I didn't know if it was him or if I was simply readying myself for the next blow. In that same second, I reflexively flung my right arm forward with every ounce of force I could muster, the otoscope still in hand. When it made contact, I heard a crack and a thud as the patient's body reeled back onto the stretcher. Without my glasses, I was essentially blind. I don't mean blind in the way of needing reading glasses for the morning paper, but blind, like I couldn't get to the sidewalk without a walking stick or a guide dog. I knelt carefully to pat down the floor, and luckily my hand reached my glasses, which were right against a cabinet, still intact. I pushed them on and stood. The patient was still lying on the stretcher, his eyes closed. He was breathing, and I didn't see any blood, but I did see a small, red circular impression in the middle of his forehead where the otoscope head had made contact. At that point, the nurses and the other attending physician had rushed into the room to see if I was all right. The other attending on shift was Dr. Christ, a 6'4" retired military man with a voice as big as his stature. He surveyed the scene. "Well, we'd better add a head CT to his orders," he said. He continued that he would assume care of the patient, and in his clear, understated way, he declared, "There's no fucking way we should come to work for this shit. These idiots coming in here thinking they can do whatever the hell they want to. Who gives a shit if he's drunk? He's just a lowlife. Why the fuck do these people bring in their shit family so we can take care of them?" I just stood there, my face throbbing. I couldn't answer Dr. Christ's questions. They'd been rhetorical, anyway. I appreciated his expressions of rage. My own anger was too choked up in my chest and bound with shame. I didn't know then the exact source of the shame, but I knew what I felt. I was ashamed that a man had struck me in the face, that the blow had left purple welts on my nose and cheek that hurt when I put my glasses back on. I was ashamed that I couldn't scream at the patient or pummel him the way I believe a man who harms a woman deserves to be pummeled. Maybe most of all, I was ashamed that I had been made to feel so weak in my position of supposed power. I was a grown-up now, a doctor, not a child witnessing my father's violence at home. Big Hector. A nurse whose nickname describes him perfectly asked if I was okay. The other techs and nurses did, too. They called security as well. My interaction with the Philadelphia police was brief. An officer took my statement, and we completed the necessary paperwork for the department so that the patient would be banned from care in our hospital system. I declined to press charges, given that it would require a lot of my time to do so, and because while I was sure the man's violence had nothing to do with his inebriation, violence never does. I had doubts about whether the charges would stick in a man with a documented history of intoxication. Because the incident happened at the end of my shift, I could go right home, something I badly needed to do. When I got to my apartment, I took a naproxen and went to bed with the conviction that I would not dream about what had just taken place. And now, almost 2 years later, I was faced with another yellow alert, another reminder of how little power we physicians actually have. Despite my efforts, I couldn't stop thinking about the physician who'd been assaulted by this patient I was about to see. I had tremendous respect for this doctor I'd never met, for the restraint it must have taken for her, after being violated, to calmly put down her scalpel and walk away. I would like to think I would have done the same. I suppose I had, with my inebriated patient doing just enough to ensure my safety, and then leaving. After all, it was about survival, not retribution. She was lucky she hadn't accidentally killed her assailant when he groped her. But if that had been her reflexive response when under attack, she would have been in the right. It infuriated me that in the world of medicine, a female healthcare provider could be attacked without consequence, without any means of redress. It was as if patients were permitted such assaults. Why was it that the woman must quietly walk away while the aggressor is allowed to return to the emergency department at any time with the expectation of being serviced? I stood there in the staff lounge wishing it were easier to be human, wishing we could shed our binary views around gender and power, views that have never served humanity well. I longed for our society to move closer to a harmony where the yellow alerts would fade away so that when I clicked on a patient's history, I would see just another gray computer screen. It turned out there was coffee in the break room. I touched the side of the pot to find it was still hot. I poured some into my cup and added cream and sugar to the grainy brown brew, thin and watery and likely at least 5 hours old. In any other circumstances, it would have been unpalatable, but to the end of a night shift, it was ambrosial. I inhaled caffeine and a hint of motor oil and took the first sacred sip. Now, I was prepared for the patient. I had no choice but to see. It was true that I didn't know him at all, so was it fair to judge? I had to admit that there might have been extenuating circumstances to explain this patient's degeneracy. After all, I knew nothing more than what had come up in the notes. Maybe he had been abused as a child. It is not uncommon for boys who are abused to become abusers themselves. It is never a justification, of course, but it is an eventuality that deserves compassion. For all I knew, he had gotten therapy since the assault and was now a fundraiser for the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. It was a long shot, but it was possible. It still felt appropriate to make the patient wait, but I knew that there would eventually be other patients to see after him, and it wouldn't be right to delay their care. I had squandered 6 minutes, and there was still only one patient in the ER. I grabbed the male nurse who'd been assigned to the patient, Mike, and we headed over to his room. On the way, Mike grunted under his breath. I can't believe this guy is allowed to come back here. It's shameful. I half smiled at him in solidarity. The curtain to the room was ajar, revealing a wiry white man lying uncomfortably on the stretcher. His full head of dark hair made him look much younger than he was. His chart said 51. There was no sheet on the bed and no blanket. The man was tall and naked except for the thin white hospital gown embellished with navy blue geometric shapes. He seemed not to notice or care that as he lay on the stretcher, writhing from side to side, his gown splayed open, revealing his bare backside. Mike stood on one side of the room, and I stood next to him and leaned against the supply cart. I needed this bracing as well as the distance. Mike and I stared at the patient as he flopped around like a fish on a hook. I sighed, making sure to convey that I was a distant authority figure. I said, "Mr. Samuels, I'm Dr. Harper. What brings you in today?" Showing a little less enthusiasm than I might have displayed when asking if he had a paperclip I could borrow. The pain, he moaned. It happened again. And what might that be, sir? The hernia, he whispered in anguish. I recalled the triage note in the record. Hernia, you didn't come in for a hemorrhoid. Well, I don't know what it is. There's something swollen in my groin. It just started today, and I can't take it. He was curled in the fetal position, his knees bent to his chest. As he spoke, he buried his face in his hands. Okay, I said. Let's take a look at this hernia. Lie on your back. He tried to relax his legs and attempted to pry them apart. Mike and I regarded him coolly. We didn't move as we waited for him to adjust and calm himself. When he was more still, I walked toward him. His fists were clenched around waves of pain, and his toes twitched with the throbbing. I began to raise his gown and told him to straighten his legs. His arms started to flex up and move toward me. I quickly dropped the edge of his gown and leaned back. Put your arms down, I commanded. Keep your arms down by your sides. Stay still. Straighten your legs. His thighs were tense as I tapped the side of his right leg. Okay, open up. His legs stayed clamped. I didn't attempt to hide my annoyance. Sir, would you like to be examined or not? I continued, already knowing the answer. The only way I can do that is if you show me the area that is bothering you. I could sense Mike rolling his eyes, but I was too close to the patient to do anything more than grimace. The patient lifted his gown and spread his legs enough to reveal a large, firm swelling extending from his right groin to his left scrotum, which was stretched to the size of an eggplant. The skin was so taut that it glistened. Still cautious, but focused, I reached out to palpate his scrotum. I couldn't identify any anatomic landmark. I tried to follow what I imagined might be a thick cord-like swelling down the inguinal canal, but all I could really discern was a balloon of exquisitely tender human flesh. What should I push back into place, and where? What was intestine and what was testicle? Was there a perforation or dead bowel? An infection? I turned to Mike, who had already started to grab supplies. Our faces softened. This was a surgical emergency. Yes, the man was likely an awful human being, but his pain was real. Sir, we will need to put in an IV and check some blood work. We will also need to perform a CAT scan to see what exactly is going on with your hernia. You are right that there is a serious problem here. I have to find out if it's infected and how it is stuck. I will also call a surgeon because you will certainly need an operation to fix this. While all this is going on, we'll make sure you're comfortable. We'll give you pain medication right away. He looked up at me and nodded. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, doctor. His eyes were a tremulous, pale gray. I didn't remember the name of the female physician he had assaulted, only that it had sounded Indian. Was she dark-skinned like me? I wondered if Mr. Samuels saw her when he looked at me. I tore off my gloves and started to enter the orders into the computer. I asked the clerk to page surgery so I could give them a head. As I waited for the call back, I stared into my coffee, remembering how slowly I had stirred in the half and half as Mr. Samuels's legs had twisted in pain. How painstakingly I had added the sugar, almost grain by grain, as his intestines pushed against his testicles and his scrotum ballooned. To the patient, those 6 minutes of procrastination on my part must have felt like an eternity. While he certainly deserved to pay for his past violent behavior, it wasn't for me to decide when or how. In my mind, this wasn't the time. The surgeon, Dr. Castellano, was just leaving a patient's room on the floor. She said she would swing by to take a look, as the shift might change by the time Mr. Samuels's test results came back. 5 minutes later, she was in and out of the patient's room. Yeah, Dr. Harper, pretty impressive. Please give a call once the labs and CT are done. If I haven't heard from you before my shift is over, I'll let Dr. Ritashi's the day doc know to expect your call. Fate had delivered this man into the care of 3 female doctors that evening, each of whom had calmly gazed at his excruciatingly swollen genitals. Women were the ones to inspect him, to touch him, and, ultimately, to slice open his flesh, to save his life. Was any of this irony lost on him? From that experience, did he learn how it felt to be vulnerable? I wondered if it might expand his definition of gender, what it meant to be female or male. I wanted to believe that he would never grab a woman again, and I took another moment to stand there trying to convince myself that this could be true. Probably not, but maybe. I'd update the surgeons with the details of his CT, which would confirm his strangulated hernia, so they could better plan his case for the OR to remove the dead bowel and close up the deficit in his fascia that had allowed the breach, so that now his body was busted like his character. If Mr. Samuels were ever to evolve, it would be due to experiences like this one, where people who didn't have to care for him chose to do so anyway, regardless of his past actions, and, yes, people who commit the type of violence that Mr. Samuels did should be held accountable by the appropriate people in the appropriate ways. Still, his life lessons were for him alone to choose to learn from or disregard as he decided. If I were to evolve, I would have to regard his brokenness genuinely and my own tenderly, and then make the next best decision. My choosing to care about his welfare, my decision to hold in my heart the best intention for another human being, no matter who that person is or what they have done. That day in the ER, despite my disgust at his previous behavior and the possible moral decay that had led him to it, was a social action. 2 more patients flashed on the board, a sore throat and eye discharge, but they would wait just a little while longer while I finished with Mr. Samuels. Chapter 5, Dominic. Body of evidence. Just make him do it. A voice rang out, followed by the sound of metal grating on metal. I leaned past my computer screen toward the triage area to see a young man in handcuffs, chafing at the bony prominences of his reddened wrists. Fading charcoal gray lines of graphic tattoos on his left forearm were almost indecipherable against his dark skin. I didn't do nothing. The prisoner shouted, "That's enough out of you." A police officer commanded, "Listen, we have to take your vital signs. Put on this gown." The voice was from Carl, the charge nurse assigned to head the nursing team for the shift. "I ain't doing nothing. I don't want to be here. I don't want to put on that gown. I'm not doing nothing." The young man looked away from the charge nurse, who tried to stare at him straight in the face. Away from the officer, who looked only at the nurse. Away from the audience comprising the full occupants, who were intently watching the show. His white shirt, made brighter still by the contrast of his chocolate skin, quivered with every shallow exhale. His dark jeans were clean and fit perfectly, as if he had just been wearing them on a diesel runway. His white trainers weren't new, but they were certainly well cared for, bright, clean, polished. He couldn't have been more than 5'9" and looked thin and frail under his fashionable attire. The 4 officers who brought him in seemed like overkill, like rolling in military tanks to secure a small-town demonstration. At the same time, I can't claim with absolute certainty that the show of force wasn't indicated. I've seen a 125-pound man on PCP evince Herculean strength that required everyone in the emergency department to subdue him with injectable tranquilizers and physical restraints. I always felt bad watching a patient being wrestled to the floor, knowing that he could be injured, knowing that, heaven forbid, he could be killed, even though we were doing it for his protection and ours. Even when everyone has the best of intentions, things can go terribly wrong. Yes, the patient had chosen to take the PCP, necessitating that the authorities be called and he'd be brought to the ER, thereby involving us in the danger of his personal decisions. Although, in so many ways, we in the ER pay the price for a patient's choices. It never feels okay when there is a complication, because the stakes are so high. The moment we decide we have to go hands-on, the critical action is always contained in the question before. Is this truly necessary? You're gonna have to make him do it, one police officer said to Carl. He has to be examined, so you're just gonna have to make him comply. I shifted my chair to keep one ear and one eye on the commotion, eavesdropping as I clicked away at my computer. This section of the ER was circular, with the doctor's station in the middle, so it was possible to keep an eye on most rooms. The situation didn't appear to be diffusing, so I knew I needed to wrap up my work and head to triage. What's his name? Carl asked. Dominic, the same officer replied. Dominic, you're gonna have to put on this gown and let us examine you, Carl said firmly. I ain't doing nothing. These cops are lying. I didn't do nothing, and I don't want to be examined. I don't want to be here, he exclaimed as drops of spittle flew from his mouth, as if suddenly resigned. His face became a mask of calm, but that flying spittle told another story. Someone, please get the doctor. An exasperated charge nurse entreated. Hearing this, Lauren, the second-year resident who was my charge for that day, took 5 hurried steps over to the melee. Lauren's steps were always hurried and overconfident. She was pale white, of average height, with a narrow nose and a frame as slender as her fine mousy blonde hair, which fell limply in a taut ponytail at the nape of her neck. She would have been entirely nondescript if not for the salience of her habitual condescension. She, like me, had heard the drama unfold. I was the only attending physician on in my section and just wanted 3 precious minutes to finish up with the last 5 cases before delving into this quagmire. I could practically hear Lauren put her hands on her hips as she asked, "What's going on here?" "I'm Dr. Morgan. What seems to be the issue, officers?" "Call." I took a deep breath, knowing that she would not be the one to resolve this situation. I just needed 170 more seconds to wrap up my work so I could smooth things over in triage. I also knew that I had to give Lauren a chance to at least attempt effective mediation. She was, after all, my trainee, and thus my obligation for the next 9 hours, 47 minutes, and 32 seconds. I took a deep breath for another reason. I wanted so badly, when I entered the triage area, to see black officers and a white prisoner, or at least one black officer and a non-black prisoner. Anything other than the stereotypical white cop black prisoner scenario. But I had already surveyed the scene, so I already knew I made myself take another breath that, in triage, was the configuration of characters I least wanted to see. We are not yet at a time in America when the attributed or perceived actions of a brown or black or queer or Muslim wrongdoer are considered singular. Instead, such accused are seen as emblematic of an entire demographic, one labeled guilty before charged. And yet, the overwhelming majority of spree killers from the most notable mass shootings in U.S. history are male and white. The crimes of each of these assailants are repeatedly viewed as individual acts indicative of one sad, tormented man's mental state and not of his entire gender, and certainly not of his race. This privilege of individual self-determination is purposefully not extended to all. Strangely but not coincidentally, these massacres do not lead to large-scale examinations of the state of maleness or whiteness in America, both topics that Americans most desperately need to examine. That it could not be delayed any longer. I stood up and removed my gray fleece and put on my long white coat. At that time in my career, I always had my white coat with me. In truth, I used it more to hold a collection of medical references and my favorite pen light, which had pupil measurements on its side, than to show everyone that I was a doctor. In fact, I almost never wore it. I found it cumbersome to run around an ER wearing a long coat with full pockets, and indeed, it became a liability in the department. Just another item I had to protect from blood, vomit, and bedbugs. But apart from what I could stash in its pockets, there were times when it was a useful costume. Sometimes I had to explain to a family member that her courageous mother had just passed away, or ask another if his father's end-of-life wishes included cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The coat was my garment of choice for such conversations. It was a uniform that signaled expertise, authority, confidence, and now here was another scenario in which I had found it came in handy. That as I approached, Lauren was looking directly at the patient and saying, "Sir, you are going to have to do what we say. You did something that is dangerous and life-threatening. Now you are under arrest. You must get in this gown, and then we will examine you." No invitation, no question. Simply her interpretation of the events and a directive to comply. No one moved. Suited up, I approached the stalemate. I looked at the patient's face. He was turned away, looking at nothing in the far corner of the room. His chin was tilted upward, his jaw tight, his brow glistening with the first signs of perspiration. His breathing was rapid and shallow. I clasped my hands in front of my chest. "Hello, sir," I said softly. He lowered his head to look at me. I was anywhere from 12 to 4 inches shorter than everyone else in the area. He and I were at least 10 shades darker than everyone else in the triage room. "Sir, what's your name?" His jaw loosened just enough for him to say, "Dominic." "Yes, and your last name?" I asked. "Thomas, Dominic Thomas." "Hello, Mr. Thomas. I'm Dr. Harper. I'm the doctor in charge here, so I just have to ask you a couple questions. I'm sure they're the same ones everyone else has asked you. Please just bear with me. Can I first ask you why you're in the emergency department today?" "I don't know. I didn't do nothing," he said, his voice rising. I saw his neck and shoulders begin to tense and his arms extend behind him. Nearly shouting, he continued, "They arrested me and brought me here for nothing." Officer Quigley, one of the 4 large white officers standing around the patient, spoke up. "Dominic here is under arrest for drugs. We raided the house and saw him swallow bags of drugs when he was trying to flee the scene. That's why he's here. We need you to examine him and get the bags out." Turning back to Dominic, I asked, "Mr. Thomas, did you swallow bags of drugs?" He sucked his teeth and then replied, "No. They don't know what they about." I looked back at the officer who'd spoken. He rolled his eyes and looked away. "Mr. Thomas, of course I have to make sure you understand that if you or anyone swallowed bags of drugs, it is really dangerous. The bags could cause a blockage in your bowels. Even worse, they could leak and cause all sorts of things like heart attack, an inability to breathe, pain, and even death." "I got it, miss, but I didn't do it, so it's not an issue." "Okay, can I just ask you a couple more questions? It'll be fast." "Yeah. Do you have any medical problems?" "No." "Do you take any medications?" "No." "Are you allergic to anything?" "No." "Any surgeries?" "No." "Any alcohol or drugs today?" "No." "And my last question, Mr. Thomas, would you like us to examine you today?" "No. I want to get out of here." "Okay, then we will discharge you." At this, the officers bristled. Officer Quigley exclaimed, "We brought him here for an examination. You have to examine him. That's the procedure." "What procedure are you referring to?" I asked. I didn't accept what the cop was telling me, and I questioned why he felt comfortable instructing me to do anything at all. "Ma'am, we do this all the time," he said, sighing. The sigh telegraphed to me that this man, this older, taller, heavier white cop, felt I was both missing a critical point and wasting his time. "Oh, do you all have a court order for us to examine this man against his will?" I asked, implying that this must surely be the missing piece of information. "No, but he's under arrest for a crime." "I do understand what you're saying, but it is against the law to force a medical examination on a competent adult human being. If you don't have a court order, I would be breaking the law to do further medical evaluation on this man against his will. So, if Mr. Thomas does not want a medical examination, there will be no medical examination, because this is his right and this is the law in the entire United States of America." Officer Quigley, the charge nurse, and the resident all stared at me. Then they began to explain to me that other physicians had forced such exams on patients. "I'm sorry to hear that," I told them. "I'm sorry to hear that there are doctors who will break the law for this reason. I am not one of those physicians. Lauren turned around and went back to her desk. Dr. Call, whose face communicated total disbelief, asked, "So we're just gonna let him go, with no triage or anything?" Because he wouldn't even let me triage him, I turned back to the patient. "Mr. Thomas, is it okay to just take some quick vital signs on you? Just a couple of things like your blood pressure and heart rate. I promise it won't even take 2 minutes. As long as your vitals are okay, we'll get you right out of here." "I'm not putting on that gown," he scowled. "You don't need to change for this at all." "Okay, go ahead. Thank you." I turned to Carl. "Excellent. I already got the history, so triage is done. He refuses any examination, which is his prerogative, so I'll start on his discharge papers now. Just give a yell with those vitals when you get them." I turned away from the triage area, the dumbfounded police officers, and the annoyed charge nurse. I overheard nurses on both sides of the department debating the ethics of my letting the prisoner go. I heard them telling stories of how it was common hospital practice to make an intervention, of how just the other day Dr. Brisbane, another ER doctor, had placed an NG tube up the nose of a patient, down the back of his throat, and into his stomach to pump gallons of White ELY, the fluid used in a colonoscopy prep, into his gut until his stool ran clear, to remove the alleged drugs from his system. This was the first I'd heard of this frankly horrifying malpractice, because attending physicians in the ER tend to work in parallel to each other, with their sole focus on expediting the care of their individual patients. The only time I got wind of what my colleagues were up to was during sign-out or through rumor. This work just got harder, while practicing medicine was feeling increasingly crucial, personally. Between the hospital bureaucracy and the colleagues who brought their limited perspectives to work, they were, after all, only human. The prospect of it being a sustainable career path for me was diminishing. As I listened to the war stories of heroic medical efforts on unwilling captives, Maria, a feisty Latina transplant from the Bronx, chimed in. "Yeah, well, Dr. Harper is correct. You cannot force an examination on anyone just because the police or family member or any third party happens to request it. We need to treat people like human beings. I'm tired of people treating certain people like animals." I wanted to stand up and second everything Maria had just said, but I already had, in my management of the case. Besides, I needed a rest from standing, knowing that just seconds after I finished wrapping up Dominic's case, I'd have to stand up again. For those few moments, I typed. To the extent it was possible, I'd stay out of the line of gossip. I leaned toward Lauren, who was positioned at the computer station just in front of mine. "Don't worry about this case. I'll write him up. Just move on to the next patient. Nothing for you to do here, since I already took care of it." Lauren looked at me with her typical antagonism. "Are you sure? I can write it up. I'm actually waiting for a call back from hospital ethics." I told them the whole case, because I don't think he can refuse an exam and medical interventions. "We really need the ethics board in on this one if you're going to let him go. I've worked with Dr. Linden and Dr. Jacobson on similar cases, and we just tell the prisoners what we are going to do. They don't have a choice. I don't understand what you're doing." Her tone was more indictment than question. It was the tone she used to assert that she knew more than I did, and for reasons she would never have dared articulate. It was the very fact that Lauren felt comfortable assuming greater inherent wisdom on the part of the white male physicians, Linden and Jacobson, that might have horrified her to examine in herself. For these same reasons, their white privilege, she would have followed their instruction anywhere, even if they directed her to literally break the law. While she wouldn't have spoken the words, her tone communicated one of the ubiquitous microaggressions faced by people of color, and the content of her words showed how such a microaggression is inextricably linked to the gross aggression that follows. Although I had been having issues with Lauren over the past 16 months, we had worked together. It occurred to me that, in this moment, she was being entirely honest. Yes, there was her typical peevish passive-aggressive tone, but I saw now that she genuinely didn't understand. I knew her only within the confines of work, so I couldn't pretend to know why she hadn't considered these issues more deeply. Certainly, there was a type of privilege in it. Willingly or not, Lauren had donned the cloak of white male privilege, and it fit snugly over her own skin. After all, this is the only way oppression can function. It requires the buy-in of a certain percentage of those it actively oppresses in order to pit those groups of subjugated people against one another. I thought about the powerful underlying assumptions that had made it so easy for the police to transport this patient to a hospital, and for his sovereignty to be taken away. It could be related to his dealing drugs, though. We see all sorts of patients with drug-related issues, and they are not typically brought to the emergency department in chains. And there is certainly no expectation that we will simply accept that their bodies should be violated because of their alleged illegal drug use. But for Dominic, it seemed somehow warranted, somehow a commonplace, that his rights as a patient should be tossed aside. I looked at him. His autonomy was so provisional. But then, had he ever had self-determination? Had he even been considered to have ownership of his black body? There was no medical legal reason for a doctor or a hospital to usurp his capacity, and yet, for some people, it was expected. In the face of these truths, we are reminded that, for many people, their bodies are not considered their own. For those whose bodies are viewed as suspect and threatening, those bodies, at the preference of a more privileged body, could be manipulated, even assaulted. As I stood there in my white coat, I was reminded of Dr. J. Marion Sims, often referred to as the father of gynecology, who in the 19th century conducted experimental surgeries on enslaved women. The women, who had hopes of treatment from a purportedly competent physician, instead were pinned down on operating tables, screaming in agony, while he sliced into their pelvic regions without the benefit of anesthesia. Sims continued to torture enslaved women in these barbaric ways until he felt he'd perfected his techniques and felt comfortable performing them on white women. But in their case, with the humane addition of anesthesia, I was reminded also of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, in which for 40 years, beginning in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service recruited 600 black men, 399 of them with syphilis, ostensibly to offer them treatment for bad blood. The men with syphilis were intentionally denied treatment, so that the U.S. government could study the progression of the disease over the course of their lives and then autopsy them after they had died. Not only were the men in the study not informed of their disease or treated for it, but steps were taken to prevent them from receiving treatment elsewhere. For example, STD clinics were provided with a list of study enrollee names so that they would be refused treatment should they have sought it. The long-running study was not put to an end until 1972, when public pressure led to a federal investigation that deemed the Tuskegee syphilis experiment unethical. I was reminded, too, of Dr. Albert Kligman's experiments on imprisoned men in Philadelphia from the 1950s to the 1970s. Kligman biopsied, burned, and deformed the bodies of prison inmates to study the effects of hundreds of experimental drugs. Men were subjected to such atrocities as inoculation with herpes, gonorrhea, and various carcinogens. Kligman went on to become a millionaire after co-developing the popular acne medication Retina via his studies on inmates, while many of his victims were left with chronic medical conditions that irrevocably damaged their organ systems. While significant advances have been made in areas of racial equality, we still have miles to go. That day in the ER, Dominic was evidence. "Lauren," I asked, "do you know what treating this patient would entail?" "We would be commanding him to have an examination he doesn't want. We would have to restrain him in some way physically and/or chemically. We would then put a needle in him to draw blood. We would force him to have an X-ray. If the X-ray didn't show anything, and it probably wouldn't, then we would force him to have a CT. We would have subjected this man to 2 studies of radiation to pacify law enforcement, who have no legal right to force anything on his body. Who would be legally responsible if there were an adverse event from these refused medical interventions? Not to mention, who would be legally responsible for the physical assault that a forced examination would entail? You don't even know if the police are telling the truth. Why is any of this acceptable? Furthermore, even if he did swallow drugs, he is an adult who is competent and sober, and who is medically and legally allowed to make his own decisions. We can't force parents of children to allow immunizations that prevent epidemics of devastating pediatric disease. We can't force a hemorrhaging Jehovah's Witness to accept a blood transfusion. We can't force someone having a heart attack to go for a life-saving cardiac catheterization if he refuses it. You know all these things. We have all had these very cases and simply signed the patients out against medical advice. Why would this be different, even if there is a potential life threat? Lauren stared at me in silence, her posture perfect. She gently chewed her lower lip. I heard the clerk call out, "Anyone waiting for hospital ethics?" Lauren waved vigorously at the clerk to send the call to her phone. I watched and waited while she was on the phone. She didn't say much, just a series of ohs and ahs. Then, I see. Really? Okay, well, thank you for your help. I sat still at my computer, attempting to breathe in for a count of 3 and out for a count of 6, or something like it, to dampen the disgust as my anger mounted dunger that my resident, my privileged, highly educated white female resident, had felt comfortable being so disrespectful as to dismiss my judgment on this matter, that she had felt she had the right to invoke what she deemed a higher authority, older white doctors, who'd done the police's bidding in the past, or whatever voice happened to be on the other end of the line from hospital ethics. I looked down at my hands on the keyboard, my slender, dark brown hands, dry from constant washing and dousing with alcohol-based sanitizer between patients, as I noted the contrast of my dark wrists extending from the cuffs of my stark white coat. I was reminded of which costumes in America, even in the 21st century, are seen as legitimate and which are not. I recalled the conversation with my department chairman that morning. I had sunk uncomfortably into the plush leather couch across from him. Part of me awaited congratulations upon my promotion to a new hospital position. The other part, the part that felt weighty and awkward sitting 3 inches deep on this sofa, anticipated the speech he would inevitably make. It was the same speech he'd had to make several times before, to the other women and black physicians who left before I had arrived at Andrew Johnson Hospital. "Michele," he said, "you know, every time I try to make a change at this institution, I just can't. I'm always blocked. You didn't get the position. I'm sorry to say it, you're qualified. I just can't ever seem to get a black person or woman promoted here. That's why they always leave. I'm so sorry, Michele. They've decided that even though you were the only applicant, and a super qualified one at that, they're just going to leave the position open. I'm so sorry. I hope you'll hang in here with me anyway." His words had hung sadly between us. He had spoken with the heavy heart of a long-time liberal white man who would shake my hand, smile, close the door behind me, and then sit back down in his comfortable, secure chair. His effort was complete. His part was done. I was the one left to live with the limitations of that bigotry. I was the one left to get up and fight for Dominic and myself. America still has so many more strides to make. I am evidence. Lauren turned to me. "Well, the hospital ethicist says that she reviewed this case and even spoke to legal about it. Turns out it's true that we can't force any evaluation on this patient." "Well, good to know. I'm gonna go see this little kid with a cold." She closed her computer screen and headed over to room 5. I typed an extremely brief note on Mr. Thomas and swiveled in my chair to let Carl know the papers for his discharge were ready. Then, I waved goodbye to Mr. Thomas. He gave me a barely perceptible nod and then continued to stare into space. Officer Quigley grabbed the discharge papers from Carl and mumbled something about everything being so ridiculous. The officer swept his arm across the room in the direction of Mr. Thomas Gahead. He said, in a manner that decisively conveyed his utter contempt for what had just unfolded. What we had just experienced had offered an opportunity for all of us to recognize that America bears not just scars, but many layers of racial wounds, both chronic and acute. In order to move beyond them, we need to look at them for what they are, diagnose them, treat them, heal them, and then take care not to pick at the scabs, reopening the old wounds and creating new ones. I know how hard it is to stand and look at tortured and infected flesh. I know because it's part of my job, and therefore something I cannot choose to look away from. Soft skin splitting, macerated by brutality and time, half-fattened by maggots, spilling out the sides, noxious gases, spurting from the extremity of our trespasses. We need to stand face to face with it, to look and feel and smell and taste what we do, so we can choose exactly how we want to be in this world, just as we needed to look at the body of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black boy who was murdered in 1955 by 2 such white men who had accused him of flirting with a white woman while visiting relatives in Mississippi. They kidnapped the child, beat him, gouged out his eyes, shot him in the head, tied a cotton gin fan around his neck with barbed wire, and then threw his mutilated body into the Tallahatchie River. His mother insisted on an open casket at his funeral, so all of America could see how the nation treated its children, how we treated each other, how we were in this world. Dominic Thomas brought me back to the reason I had chosen to become a physician, Being a healer is the powerful gift of bearing witness in an authentic way that allows us to mindfully choose who we are. In this way, there is another path. I choose to witness the tortured flesh. I support it in my hands and cleanse the wounds as gently as I can. I apply intention and salve to heal. I write about these moments so we always remember the power of our actions. So we always remember that beneath the most superficial layer of our skin, we are all the same. In that sameness is our common entitlement to respect, our human entitlement to love. I hit send on the email I was writing, packed up my stainless steel water bottle, coffee mug, and uneaten granola bar, and tucked them all back into my lunch bag. I wanted to leave the day behind me. Once home, I shed my scrubs and then showered, rinsing off the shift. Dressed in a robe, I propped my feet up on the ottoman, and my shoulders floated down to settle into the sofa. My boss had probably received and responded to my resignation letter by now. There was comfort in knowing that this was the end of the road here. My chair would give me the time I needed to line up another job before I left. And so, I started the process of beginning again. I knew that there must be another place where, as a doctor, I could both practice medicine and climb the administrative ladder. After all, I was here to ascend. I was here to help as many people as I could. Somehow. Chapter 6, Jeremiah, Cradle and All, Montefiore Hospital in North Philadelphia was my next stop. Here, there was career mobility. Montefiore was like Mercy Light. In this way, it was a homecoming of sorts, and like any homecoming, it was a temporary return to the nest, to celebrate what was, to visit the comfortable haunts old lovers and friends who used to fit before. I molted into this new skin. There were several similarities to my residency experience at Mercy Hospital in the South Bronx. Montefiore had a volume of more than 95,000 patients a year, and Mercy had more than 145,000. At Mercy, I had been a chief resident in the Montefiore healthcare system. I was one of the assistant medical directors because I was hired to move into the director position at one of the hospital's suburban locations. I was setting meeting agendas, writing protocols for treating high-risk medical conditions such as acute stroke and heart attack, assisting in provider evaluations for staff, and sending out my own emails on blood cultures and medication documentation. Prior to starting the position, I hadn't fully realized that sending such emails in the role of assistant medical director didn't make the work feel any more relevant. As I sat at my desk in my new position, with a list of administrative tasks about standard operating procedures, proper documentation in medical records, and risk reduction, I remembered the passion that had brought me to emergency medicine in the first place, sitting with people in crisis and helping them take the first steps toward healing. Mercy Hospital had stoked the fires of this passion and had prepared me well to address the challenges faced by the Montefiore population. But our mission at Mercy had been to serve the community in a competent and culturally sensitive way, regardless of patients' ability to pay. It was an especially noble mission, given that the population in the South Bronx was as hardworking as it was poor. In fact, at that time, it was home to the poorest congressional district in the nation. 1/3 of the patients the hospital treated were entirely uninsured, and many residents didn't have a primary care physician. So, when the free clinics in the neighborhood were too busy or closed, we were literally their only hope for care. Suffering from everything from gunshot wounds to malnutrition to stroke, patients lined up for triage at Mercy. Violence in this neighborhood was as regular as leaves falling in October, and its roots lay in battles over money, respect, self-esteem, fed by deep notions of not having enough, not feeling enough, by geysers of frustration and hurt. I remembered the moment during residency when I first realized the brambly nature of this violence and these social webs. At that time, the ER at Mercy was divided into sections: adult medical, adult surgical, follow-up for wound checks, suture removals, etc., and pediatric. On that particular day during my second year of training, I was working in the pediatric side of the emergency department. The next chart on the rack read, 13-year male, head, trauma. I scanned the triage notes. Normal vitals, no medical history, a blow to the head. I tapped on the open door and introduced myself to the child, named Gabriel, and the two adults who appeared to be his parents. The boy sat at the side of the stretcher with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on his interlaced fingers. Behind him, a cartoon of a herd of purple elephants with rising red balloons decorated the wall. Mom stood near the cabinet, arms resting over her purse. Her hands were leathery, and her mouth soft. Dad sat in the chair next to the stretcher. His eyes were weary, and an earthy odor emanated from his clothes. I started by collecting the requisite information: past medical history, vaccination history, medications, allergies to medications, and so on. Then I moved to the matter at hand. The child told me that a classmate, T, routinely harassed him at school, picking on him about his appearance and threatening him. T was larger than Gabriel and part of a rough crowd. Gabriel didn't know if the other boy was in a gang, but T's crew seemed to be in and out of school as much as juvenile detention. I asked what had happened, and Gabriel relayed the following story. He had earned good grades on his report card, was helping care for his little sister, and had completed all his chores. So his parents rewarded him with the sneakers he'd wanted for his birthday, popular and pricey shoes, which he proudly wore to school the next day. On his way there, T cornered him in the empty lot next to the school grounds and demanded that he hand over the sneakers. Gabriel refused and continued walking. T followed him, and Gabriel started to run. T then jumped on Gabriel, pulled him to ground, and proceeded to punch him about the head and body. Gabriel tried to defend himself, but the other boy pulled a knife and threatened to kill him, adding that Gabriel was lucky he didn't have his gun on him that day. Terrified, Gabriel removed his shoes. T picked up the sneakers, spat on Gabriel, cursed, and walked away. After T left, Gabriel ran home, shoeless, on the hot, cracked pavement of the South Bronx. He had not passed out, had not experienced nausea or vomiting, and had no abnormal sensation to his skin or any weakness, no neck pain, no difficulty breathing. He had visible swelling and redness on the left side of his face, his shoulders, and chest, and superficial abrasions and cuts to his feet. What struck me about Gabriel was how quiet he was as he lay down on the stretcher for his examination. What's remarkable about children is how receptive and resilient their bodies are. They are more likely to bend than to break. Even if a liver tears, oozing hemorrhage from blows to the abdomen, or a blood vessel bursts behind the eye from forceful shaking, nothing is evident on the surface but the beautiful cinnamon skin of their bellies, a regular pulse at their soft wrists, and normal color in their big, bright brown eyes. Kids don't have the language to name the pain, neither physical nor psychic, nor the resources to address it. Just like adults, children house spiritual pain inside, where it sloshes around vital organs. But in children, the effects of trauma are stickier, shaping the contours of their viscera, the depth their diaphragm respires, the way their heart chambers fill. Okay, Mom and Dad, I just have to ask Gabriel a couple of questions alone, I said, knowing I needed to complete the imperative abuse screen for any child presenting with injuries. Gabriel's story made sense and sounded credible. But all too often, the assailant can turn out to be a family member or another adult the child knows. After Mom and Dad had left the room, I told Gabriel he could sit up, now that the physical exam was done. Then I pulled a chair up next to him and said, Gabriel, I am so sorry about what happened. It is terrible and unfair. That shouldn't happen to anyone. Gabriel nodded once and stared down at his thumbs. Gabriel, I have to ask you some questions to make sure you're safe. Just so you know, everything we speak about is confidential. If it turns out that you're in physical danger, then that's when I'll need to break confidentiality. It's only because we have to make sure you're safe. I want you to know that I won't do anything behind your back. We'll talk, and I'll tell you if we are in an area where we have to involve other people in the discussion. Okay, he mumbled. We ask these questions of all young people, and even all grown-ups, because sometimes people are hurt by people they love, like family members, friends, teachers. Know what I mean? Yeah, Gabriel replied. Who do you live with? My parents and little sister. How old is your sister? She's 7. Do you like your little sister? Yeah, she's cool. I mean, she gets on my nerves sometimes, but she's my sister. Yeah, she has to do that, right? I said, chuckling a little and meeting Gabriel's smile. I hear you take good care of her, don't you? He nodded. You get along with your mom and dad? I asked. Yeah. Do you feel safe at home? Yeah. Does anyone at home ever hit you or threaten you when you get in trouble or something? No. I mean, I'd be put on punishment if I don't do what I'm supposed to do sometimes. But nothing like being hit or anything. And how's school? It's okay. Do you have a favorite subject? Not really. Do you like going to school? Not really. Why not? So many problems there. Always drama. Always fights. Do you feel safe at school? Nah, but I'll take care of things. What do you mean? I mean, I will take care of things. This won't happen again. What do you mean, miss? I mean, I'll handle it. Almost reflexively, I asked the question I didn't want to ask because I didn't want to know the answer. It was so much easier to choose to believe that the possibility of escalation didn't exist here. Easier to believe that this boy would leave the hospital and be able to go to school safely and survive to graduation. Easier to believe that he didn't literally feel his life was in danger every time he left his home, or that his fear was somehow off base. I could have chosen to believe that and simply have posed a leading question. Okay, so you mean you're fine? Everyone will be okay, right? And he would have had the opportunity to nod in tacit agreement. We could then have been contentedly linked in a comfortable lie, like any lie, that would have required the active participation of both parties. But I didn't do that. Instead, I let the question jump from my lips. I can't claim any great insight in asking it. It felt more as if I were on the edge of my seat while watching a film on HBO, and had just blurted out what I most feared right before my friend shushed me, quiet. Are you planning to get even with him? Gabriel replied. I'm just gonna take care of myself. If he leaves me alone, won't be no issues. Asterisk. He sat there silently gazing at his hands as he rubbed his thumbs and tapped his foot. Again, the impulse made me ask him the obvious and seemingly ridiculous next question. It was a question that felt foreign to me, given that I had grown up in Northwest Washington, D.C., where people drove Volvos with bumper stickers, reading books, not bombs, coexist, and think locally, act globally. When my classmates parked their BMW convertibles to go to AP English class, they never worried that they would be caught. When I walked to my car from my private school, it never occurred to me that I might be threatened for my book bag, loafers, or cashmere sweater. My lesson on the impermanence of material items was a little different from Gabriel's. Toward the end of high school, I learned that parents can spend more money than they have in order to give the appearance of wealth. But that appearance is belied when one by one bathrooms are rendered unusable because the plumbing can't be maintained, and the pool algae is so dense it looks like an extension of the unkempt yard. I didn't know exactly when my family's financial ruin was at its tipping point, but by then, I was well practiced at compartmentalizing. The job of my youth had been to get out of that house and out of that life. So, when strange men knocked on our doors at all hours, asking for my father, who was invariably not there, and then left, giving no name, no message, I let it go. Honestly, I was just glad he wasn't home. And when I heard my mother on the phone mumbling something about legal fees, when my father had to close his medical practice, and when they went on to lose the court battle over house number 3 in D.C., I didn't question any of it. Anyway, my graduation from high school was only months away. Before my first year of college ended, I knew I could never go back home. Thankfully, my parents' divorce was well underway, and my father was living God knows where. My mother hadn't sued him for alimony. She'd just wanted the marriage over as quickly as possible, but she couldn't afford to maintain that home in any way. Increasingly over that period, the house lacked running water and heat. Various animals could be heard scurrying around in the attic. My brother moved out soon after I had. Our sister followed, and our mother was at home only sporadically. Fortunately, my grandparents lived nearby. My mother wasn't yet working, so she spent much of her free time at our grandparents' home, but still used our home to sleep, eat, and deal with the final proceedings. She should have lived with her parents, my grandparents, during this time. Years later, she said her reasoning for not having done so was because she didn't want to impose on them, to crowd their already crowded house, which was also home to my aunt and a cat. But I never found this answer truthful. What's more honest is that for my mother, most topics of discussion, whether it was why she picked abusive men, my brother's father was her first abusive husband, my father, her second, why she valued money over health, where all the money was coming from, and where all of it went, were merely occasions for subterfuge. The real reason she couldn't live with my grandparents was because she couldn't risk their being witnesses to the truth of her life. It had been a sham, because this truth of her life was a subject she would never broach. Rather than risking my grandparents asking the obvious questions, she stayed in the dilapidated family home. It seemed easier to her, I'm sure, than being exposed to their scrutiny within their four walls. So, my mother preferred to dwell in the dark, in our home, until the matter was forcibly taken out of her hands. This was her well-worn groove. During my first 2 years in college, I worked various jobs on campus at the food court, bartending to help support myself. My father would send me money. I'd siphon off funds from the money orders he sent, and from my student jobs to forward to my mother until she had a steady job and had moved out of the district. During my second year of college, my mother had a yard sale to raise money for herself. I wanted to get back to secure the items I cared about, but she said there wasn't time to wait for a semester break. Besides, she added, someone must have already bought the ceramic fish I made in my favorite high school art class. I'd fashioned it after one of the fighting fish I remembered from our fish tank, but toned down the hues to black and teal, and apparently, it was anybody's guess what had happened to the woodblock I carved under the same instructor and the pastoral prints I made from it. Gone, too, were the ceramic mugs I'd made in elementary school. I was glad when my mother left Washington, but the going was cruel. It felt like the void left after a fire, except there hadn't been a fire. There had just been two adults who'd haphazardly collided just long enough to produce children, create decades of chaos, and then flee, leaving their offspring to pick up the scattered pieces however they could. So, I understood how things got lost and stolen. I got the pain of instability. I knew the pain of the kind of violence that happens privately, at home. The violence that's not reported, much less discussed. The violence you can't escape because it's where you lay your head, until you can manage to pack up and secure a safe place to bathe, to eat, to sleep, to be. Still, public violence was new to me. I hadn't grown up with the reality of being unsafe outside the home, of not knowing whether you can walk to the store without being attacked, or go to school without being shot. I had only a hint of this insecurity while growing up with my brother in the 1990s. There were nights when I was worried about his safety driving while black, but that was during an era in D.C. when black men of affluence were spared the violence wrought upon poor men of color. Those times have since changed. In this one way, our country has moved closer to class equality. Sure, there were other rare acts of public violence in my community, a kidnapping in a park, a robbery in a grocery store parking lot, but these incidents were uncommon, so we felt safe, at least outside the home, if not within. Still, I read the news and listened to NPR. And theoretically, I knew these things happened. So, a little embarrassed, I asked Gabriel. On that day at Mercy Hospital in the South Bronx, the question I had to ask, do you have a weapon? A gun or a knife? A gun, I asked again. You have a gun. He said nothing. I tried again. Do you have access to a gun? Don't worry about it, miss. Don't worry about it, he replied tersely, indicating that this would be his final answer. Gabriel, this is all very dangerous. This is one of those instances I mentioned before, where I have to break confidentiality. Anytime a young person mentions that they have access to a gun and may use it to cause harm, we have to speak with the social worker just to keep you safe. Gabriel didn't move and didn't say anything. I waited for any response or sign. He simply shook his head and froze. I'll be right back, I said. I went outside and spoke to my supervising attending physician. I presented the case to her residents. Must review all patient cases with their supervising attendings, concluding my presentation with my assessment that, given the disclosure of potential violence by firearm, I had to speak with the boys, parents, and the social worker. She advised me to proceed. I put a page out to social work and then went to the parents, who were waiting outside the examination room. I summarized for them the situation and my concerns. They looked at me plainly, waiting for the question, waiting for clarification of why I was alarmed. Now we were all confused. They were stumped by my concern, and I was puzzled by their stance. We all went into the room to join Gabriel, who looked up at his parents. Miss, his mother said to me, if he has to defend himself, he has to defend himself. I paused. The statement was deceptively plain. I was horrified that his parent normalized what sounded like retaliation. It hadn't taken long in my career for me to learn that violence fun begets more violence. Each trauma alert, each young person we pronounced, each patient who, if lucky, left the hospital with a colostomy bag, tracheostomy, or wheelchair proved this point. I also knew firsthand that self-defense could make the difference between being memorialized or graduating, and that no child should ever be put in the position to have to make that choice. Okay. This is a very dangerous situation. Anytime we receive information about potential gun violence, We have to get social work involved to ensure everyone is safe, is what came out. What are you saying, miss? Are you going to take our son from us? The mother asked with the first hint of concern I perceived in her voice. The father slumped back in his chair, propped his head against the wall, and sighed. Closing his eyes, Gabriel sat up in the stretcher. For the first time during this discussion with his parents, he looked me squarely in the face. His eyes were glassy with disbelief, the way I had looked at the 2 DC police officers who came to our door and said they would arrest my brother, too, after I had summoned them to stop my father's violence. That night, they had communicated to my family that we were all implicated somehow, so all of us would have to pay. Now, as I stood there looking down at this child, I knew how he felt. I knew that there wasn't anything I could say or do to make him feel otherwise. We were all in this mess together, and none of us would leave feeling vindicated or clean. No, that is not the aim here. No one wants to take you away from your family. That will not happen here, I stated, in a desperate attempt to clarify my intentions. As I stood there waiting for the social worker to arrive, I wondered why, in all my growing up years, no physician had ever spoken to me alone to ask if I was safe. Neither had a teacher, mentor, or other family member. For that matter, I wondered what might have transpired if they had. I imagined that I, too, would have felt reluctant and scared. I did know that it would have taught me a valuable lesson, one I would have carried with me for the rest of my life. There are adults who will protect another human being. This was something I had to learn later, on my own, once I finally left that house. The ER social worker, Aisha, arrived and took her report. Aisha was as conscientious as she was fabulously experienced. While she was undoubtedly a phenomenal social worker, she could have been a notable fashion blogger, too. Each day, she sported her pixie cut with a different selection of dangly earrings depending on her ensemble. How she adroitly walked the hospital halls during her entire shift in 4-inch heels as if they were sneakers is still a mystery to me. When she completed her consultation with the family, she pulled me aside to summarize her findings. She told me that these were hard-working parents who were doing the best they could. Mom worked full-time at a grocery store, typically doing overtime to make ends meet. Dad was a janitor, working all hours of the night and day while doing contractor work on the side. They lived in a violent neighborhood riddled with crime. Drugs were sold on every corner, and you tuned out gunshots the way suburbanites tune out the crickets' chorus at dusk. Aisha placed her hand on my arm. Her tone was kind but resigned. She didn't break a sweat, and her brow was unfurrowed. Clearly, this was a conversation she had with newbies like me, all the time. Miss Schaff, when you're at war, the rules are different. The members of this family, they're soldiers in a way. They're fighting for their families. The frame of reference in war is different. The atrocities of a war zone are a normal part of life, and you do what you have to do to survive, to make it out, to make it home. She sighed. You know, these are really good people. None of this is right. Gabriel shouldn't think it's okay to use a gun. There are other ways, of course. And he shouldn't feel he has to have a gun to feel safe at school. Schools should be safe. There are other ways for that, too. She sighed again, this time even more heavily. Oh, child, she said, shaking her head. Anyway, there's no proof that this kid really has access to a gun. No one in his family has one, either. I'll write up my report, and we'll check on the family. There's nothing else to do here. She shook her head again and smiled. Unless the ER can give these people jobs that are actually living wage and safe places to live. She picked up her clipboard and began to walk away, and then turned to me and asked, Can we do that, Doc? Lord knows, I wish we could do that. Have a nice day. You know how to reach me. She waved, turning to see the next patient down the hall. That was years ago now. I never found out what happened to Gabriel and his family, yet his story, their story, haunts me. Now I stood in the trauma bay at Montefiore, waiting to receive the latest trauma notification, all of us robed, gloved, and ready. The call had come in, 2 young men shot, one in the head, the other in an extremity. When trauma alerts like this one came in, I often thought about how the patient could be Gabriel, or so many others like him. It was the beginning of my shift, so I would be taking the more seriously injured one. It's common practice for the fresher doctor to handle any new critical patient. The other doc would head up the less serious injury, in Trauma Room 2. While my team and I were in Trauma 1, we figured the incident was gang-related, But then, that was almost a given. As I stood at the head of the bed, I checked my suction and laryngoscope blade one last time. One tech was at the foot of the bed with trauma shears to cut off all clothing for full exposure so we could check for wounds. Another pulled out a seat collar, a rigid neck brace used to stabilize the cervical spine in any trauma patient where neck injury hasn't been ruled out. Just in case EMS didn't have time to place one in the field. One nurse was on either side of the bed, each with an IV setup. The nurse to my right had fluids hanging, the one on my left had monitor leads and the code card. There were 2 med students in the room, whispering to each other in eager anticipation. This was their first shift in the emergency room, and they probably already felt like they were in the middle of a popular reality show episode. "Please, just let them get here," I implored. Standing there in the trauma room, I could practically feel the charts building up in the main ER. With a groan, I pinched the top of my mask snug to the bridge of my nose to prevent condensation on my face shield. I stood there thinking about all the things that could go wrong and how I could address them. What if the GSW was to the mouth and I couldn't intubate? What if it was to the neck and I couldn't even manage a tracheotomy? There are times, too, when the EMS notification is completely wrong. There was the time a GSW to the chest was called in that was actually a flesh wound to the arm. Who knows, maybe the guy coming in was only grazed on his scalp. Nurse Ramirez walked through the trauma room doors with an update. "Just a heads up that y'all will only get the GSW to the head." The other male was diverted to Episcopal. "Since they're in opposing gangs, the less craziness we have here, the better. They should be here any second." "Thanks, Chief Brian," one of the techs replied. We heard thunderous rattling at the ambulance entrance. Then EMS appeared, pushing in a gurney with 2 enormous black sneakers hanging off the edge, kicking in twisting movements. The legs were clad in jeans, streaked crimson. Then a torso emerged, a striped shirt with blood dripping down the right side and bits of fleshy matter about the chest. Blood leaking from a pressure dressing to his scalp streaked the floor. "Sorry, this was a scoop and run," one medic announced, beginning his report. 20-something-year-old man, GSW2 head, GCS, anywhere from 13 to 15. It's hard to tell because he's agitated. Blood pressure 110/70, heart rate 140, saturating 95% on room air. We couldn't get IVS. We couldn't tube him in the field. They parked their gurney next to our stretcher and transferred the patient. One medic began to help Brian cut off the clothes as the other medic continued his stream of information. It was just madness at the scene. Sorry for the delay. There was a huge crowd and some fighting still going on. The police had to get us in and out as they secured the scene. Then we just drove like hell to get here. "What's his name?" asked as I looked down at the fallen giant on the bed. He had to be at least 6'4" and probably 300 pounds. Asterix friends said they call him Jay. His ID says Jeremiah. It's with registration. Jeremiah was enormous and thrashing and bleeding from his right scalp. With swift precision, EMS and Brian cut off his jeans, bloodstains on the legs, but no injuries. Next, they cut off his shirt. More bloody marks scarring his torso and arms, but no deformity, no injuries, no swelling. There was so much blood. We in emergency medicine do this work every day, but we never entirely numb ourselves to the impact of the body being rent apart to let rivers of life flow from arteries and veins. I couldn't imagine a day when it wouldn't be disturbing to see blood burst forth, as if from a broken levee. I could see no deformity to the neck. Jeremiah was breathing. He was moaning. He was emitting sounds of anguish. His GCS, or Glasgow Coma Scale, which measures a patient's level of consciousness on a scale of 1 through 15, was somewhere near 15, which was reassuring. Once he was fully exposed, the nurses placed the patient on the monitor and prepared the IVS. His blood pressure was technically normal. Given the stress he was under, that was a very bad sign. The constellation of fast heart rate and relative hypotension here signaled that he might have a life-threatening hemorrhage, not to mention the possibility of a catastrophic brain injury. The patient was flailing around, and the EMS guys and Brian grappled to get his legs down. The nurses called the med students over to hold down each arm while they placed one large bore 4 into each antecubital area of his arm, which in lay terms is the crease in the inner arm where the elbow bends. We needed venous access to stabilize him. It was like wrestling with Goliath, an agitated and confused Goliath. "Jeremiah, Jeremiah, do you hear me?" I called to him softly, placing one palm on his left cheek while inspecting his head. The only wound, which was too much, was the section of his skull that shattered into his brain. Blood oozed from this wound in his right skull around matted chunks of tissue. "Where am I, Christian? Mom?" he screamed out, thrusting his head from side to side, splattering blood around the head of the bed. His eyes were shut tight as he moaned and cried. A mix of tears and blood streamed down his dark cheeks. His skin was the color of deep mahogany, smooth and rich. I placed my hands on each side of his head to coax him to stillness. Looking directly down at him, I asked, "Jeremiah, look at me. Can you look at me?" His eyes cracked open, and he looked behind my mask, past my glasses, and into my eyes. "Can you help me? Please, please help me," he cried. "Jeremiah, we are going to help you. Try to be calm. Please try to be still so we can help you." I chanted to him like a lullaby. "Please, please save me. Please, please save me," he begged, as he stared into my eyes. "Jeremiah, we will help you," I chanted, begging him to believe me, hoping we could both be soothed by my words. Jeremiah wept. He wept in waves. He wept in howls that stirred the marrow. He wept from a place of pain much deeper than the GSW to his head. Pain that hurt more than having bits of his skull shot off and lying on the sidewalk. "Jeremiah, I am here to help you," I said, gazing between the spaces of his tears as I placed my other hand on his shoulder. I'm going to DAGI. I'm going to DAGI. He gulped in great hiccuping wails. "We're here for you, Jeremiah." I knew that my words were more important than the medicine I would push into his veins to dampen his consciousness and paralyze his muscles. More important than the breathing tube I would slide down his throat to take control of his breath. More important than the entire surgical team that had been activated for him. I looked deeper into his eyes and moved my hand to his right cheek to cradle his face, because I knew that he was correct. I knew that he was at a crossroads, that he was touching grace. I knew that no matter what he had done to end up in the he deserved to be comforted right now. "Dr. Harper, we have a line," reported Trish, one of the nurses. "Excellent," I said to her, flashing a thumbs up. "Let's start with lidocaine 150 milligrams, then 30 milligrams of etomidate, and 150 milligrams of succinylcholine," I said, requesting the medications that would relax him so I could perform an endotracheal intubation. I grabbed my blade and looked into his eyes for the final time. "Now, Jeremiah, you're going to sleep." After he slipped into unconsciousness, I advanced the breathing tube into his trachea and the respiratory team attached the CO2 detector. We noted good color change, so they placed him on the ventilator. I tore off my bloody gloves to take my stethoscope and listened to his chest. There was good air entry bilaterally. Another indicator the endotracheal tube was where it should be. The surgical team flooded the room and whisked Jeremiah off to the operating room. The techs and nurses had moved on to the next patient. EMS loaded up their truck for the next ride. The room was empty save for the aftermath of what had just happened. Monitor leads, swung from their screens, and plastic needle caps were strewn across the floor, along with a mosaic of bloodstains and discarded gloves. I surveyed the scene and was reminded of how these resuscitation rooms are often the most tragic. Confessionals. A police investigator came into the room, breaking the silence. He wanted to take my statement. How did the patient present? What was his condition on arrival? What had we done for him in the ER? What was his status when he left the ER? I answered his questions. We finished the interview, thanked each other for our respective hard work, and stepped over debris to get back to our jobs. Nurse Esteban met us at the door to say, "Doc, or called. The patient coded on the table and died." The detective heard him. "Okay, now it's a homicide." "Thanks, guys," he said as he walked out of the department. I looked up at Esteban, then I nodded and sighed. It wasn't that I was surprised or confused. It was not surprising that a man who had been shot in the head would die. There was nothing confusing about a man crying out that he was going to die, proving that, in fact, he had perfect insight. In that moment, no, my sigh acknowledged the moment he had had with himself and his life, with his blood and his tears, as he was absolved by the bright lights of the trauma bay. It was an understanding that, no matter the hand we are dealt at the beginning of our lives, in the end, we face our actions alone. Jeremiah had called out for Mama and for Christian, but in our final moments, everyone we've honored or betrayed is, ultimately, not with us. We lie there alone, flesh and bone, soon to be only spirit. It occurred to me that maybe Jeremiah was the Gabriel who had picked up a gun, Perhaps it wasn't Gabriel precisely, because maybe he left the ER that day. I met him and never touched a gun. Maybe Gabriel left the ER and survived to graduation and was strengthened by the challenges life threw at him. Maybe Gabriel finished college and was now mentoring his teenage sister. Or perhaps he was working toward owning his own business to improve not only his own life, but the lives of those in his family and community. I suppose it's a matter of faith whether or not we choose our starting ground before we're born into this life. Some begin the journey on flat, grassy meadows, and others at the base of a very steep mountain. One path, seemingly smooth, can make it nearly impossible for us to see the ditches and gullies along the way. The other, while painfully tough, can deliver what it promises. If you can navigate that path, you've developed the skills to scale Everest. It isn't fair on many accounts. It simply is, and assuredly, both paths include uncertain terrain ahead. As we place one foot in front of the other, we make choices at every step, no matter the terrain. When we reach the threshold that Jeremiah reached, we look back at our footprints and must face the results of our choices alone. In that recognition there is absolution. All deserve the chance to speak and be heard and be touched. If we're lucky, we're touched at every station along the journey. And if nothing else, then, at the end.
Thank you for listening. Hope that you like it. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time. Bye.